Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229. This is for a class for Monday, the 4th of October, where we are transitioning away from Frankenstein and moving into Edgar Allan Poe. I also wanted to talk about your journals, which I am working on and am returning to you via email. Remember, I'm grading that on an informal scale, so basically a plus would be excellent, a check plus would be very good, and a check would be satisfactory. That's where most of the grades usually end up. There also is a less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And I'm not grading for grammar or for mechanics. Basically, I'm viewing it as a kind of conversation on paper. So, as I'm working through my Frankenstein journals, you will see that there is an upcoming Poe journal because this week is devoted to Edgar Allan Poe. So, my intent is to have your journals back to you before your Edgar Allan Poe journal is due this upcoming Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. And of course, you can always ask me for an extension if you'd like. So, if you will remember, Lovecraft had quite a great deal to say about Edgar Allan Poe when we were talking about supernatural horror in literature. And in fact, you can see in the notes below, just to refresh your memory, I've indicated some of what Lovecraft indicated about Poe. That Poe was a vivid and detached chronicler of strangeness and gloom of the human mind. And we can judge for ourselves with some of the short stories that we will be discussing over the next week or so. And you'll keep in mind that Edgar Allan Poe helped to create the modern day short story in the way we think of it, with maintaining a single mood and a single impression. And of course, Edgar Allan Poe, just like the Gothic as a whole, can straddle different genres. Edgar Allan Poe was known for also creating the detective story. And in many of Poe's tales, just like in many Gothic tales, there's a mystery that needs to be solved. There definitely is this element of abnormal psychology, and that perhaps really differentiates Poe from many of the other authors who perhaps very gently examine the issue of psychology, but Poe very clearly examines the issue of sanity and insanity, with having narrators directly address their sanity and insanity to us. And also there is the possibility of supernatural horror, that which defies the natural order. So if Poe is indeed the creator of the modern horror story in the final and perfected state, then it's probably because of Poe's short stories, though he also is well known for some of his poems, most notably The Raven. Now, Poe's biography is just as troubled as his writing, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why his writing is so troubled. He was well known to have both drug and alcohol issues, and you can see that in his writing as well when we've got narrators who are struggling with the same. He married his 13-year-old cousin. You'll remember we were talking about Frankenstein and Victor marrying or attempting to marry Elizabeth. And ultimately, while they were not necessarily blood relations, he refers to her as cousin. And they were reared like brother and sister. But Poe literally married his cousin. And then there also is in Poe's works an examination of many of Poe's personal fears, such as the fear of being buried alive. And certainly we can view that from a symbolic or a metaphorical perspective, as we've talked about with the Gothic, that oftentimes it works best when we view it from a symbolic perspective. But it also is quite literal. It would not have been outside of the realm of possibility during Poe's time for someone to be buried prematurely. And science certainly wasn't at the point that it is today. And in fact, there was a very interesting device that was used with corpses where there would be a string tied around, let's say, something like a toe or a wrist, and then that string would go from the grave, from the actual coffin to the top of the soil. And at the top of the soil, the string would be attached to a bell, so that if for whatever reason someone had been buried prematurely and they woke, they could ring the bell and notify individuals that they were still alive. And occasionally, it doesn't happen frequently, but occasionally you hear these very odd stories in our own contemporary time about individuals being in morgues, and it was thought that they were dead, and then it turns out that they really weren't. Poe probably is best when he talks about the fear of the unknown. And in fact, that's one of the major elements that we talked about in the Gothic, is the fear of the unknown. And perhaps that is connected to Stephen King's ideas about the fear of death. as King talks about, Gothic literature is really a kind of a dress rehearsal for our ultimate deaths. The 4 short stories that I had assigned, 2 of them, The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat, are oftentimes read on the junior high school or high school level. I think part of the reason why is because Poe is just macabre enough to capture young audiences' attention, but not too macabre and too graphic so that it would be inappropriate. And the short story genre works very nicely as well for, let's say, a younger reader who might have a shorter attention span. The Mask of Red Death, which I think has some rather eerie contemporary parallels to our own time. And finally, The Fall of the House of Usher, and that's probably the most challenging of the short stories that I selected. And if you're using the text that I had ordered for the class, you can see that there are other short stories that are included, but those were the 4 that I selected. And just to give us a sense as to what Poe's writings might be like. And if you don't have the text, you can see that I've included the links for these short stories in the notes below. But rather than get into detail with the Poe short stories, I wanted to talk a little bit about writing papers. And then what we could do is talk about Poe in more depth on Wednesday. And my hope is that at this particular point, you are done reading Poe, though I understand that that might not necessarily be the case, and that you are on to our next major text at home reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so that when we get to that text, then you can begin the next text, which happens to be Dracula. And you can also think about writing papers in that we are going to be writing some journals, some informal writing assignments. We've already begun with Frankenstein. But there will also be a formal academic paper about midway through the semester. And time flies because before you know it, we'll be at that particular point. And I have a handout that I would normally distribute in class that instead is in our syllabus and other documents folder entitled Writing the Critical Paper that I wanted to review today. And hopefully it is a review. Hopefully this is something that you've discussed in previous English classes. And it was a handout that was actually given to me when I was an undergraduate, to give you a sense as to its age. It's the best that I've seen thus far about how to write a paper. So I wanted to share that with you. And basically, it divides the process of writing a paper, and writing a paper is indeed a process, into 3 steps: the planning step, the writing step, and the editing step. And I think the mistake that most authors make when they're trying to write a paper is that they try to do it all at once and they try to do all of the steps simultaneously rather than do it over a period of time, which is why I'm talking about the paper now, because my hope is that you can begin thinking about possibilities, at least for your paper. And you'll remember that I had shared with you some suggested paper topics, and that's also in the syllabus and other documents folder. But I'm encouraging you to create your own paper topics as well. So as you are reading, if something occurs to you, and certainly as I'm reading your journals, if I see something that could be applicable, I'll make a note of it, but that's not to say that I would highlight everything that could be written into a paper that you've included in your journals. Just anything that stands out to me is what I would make reference to. But certainly you can also play with ideas in your journals. And this idea of the planning stage and the writing stage and the editing stage, as I said, usually is done all at one time, more often than not right before the paper is due, so that there really isn't enough time to do any of the stages. So again, I encourage you to start earlier rather than later. And you'll notice that in the critical paper, it talks about how the point is to analyze, not to summarize, or do what I call the junior high school book report. You're not telling us what happened in Frankenstein, let's say. You're telling us why those things happened. So assume the reader has some familiarity with the text, and basically you are interpreting. So you don't need to retell the entire story. You only need to retell those elements that are necessary in order to be able to support your thesis. The thesis being the main position of your particular paper, which is usually in the introductory paragraph. So that argument should be interpretive. It shouldn't be just about a fact. It should be something that reasonable people could disagree about. So, and you don't want to have an argument that's so broad that it basically doesn't say anything at all. And the example in the handout is In Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. And the difficulty with that thesis is that it's so broad, it applies to every author and every text probably that's ever been written in the world of literature. Also, saying something like Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet, again, think about how we could say that about every author. What the point is not that imagery is employed, but how and why that imagery is employed. So, usually, what we do after we've got our introductory paragraph that gives also the text, the name of the text, and the name of the author, as well as our thesis, is that we develop our body paragraphs. Now, keep in mind that a paragraph is minimum 3 sentences long, preferably longer. So anything less than 3 sentences is not an academic paragraph, even though you might see paragraphs with 2 or even 1 sentence in, let's say, journalistic writing. But you need to have an opening sentence, a middle sentence, and some sort of a concluding sentence. And the reality is that your paragraphs will probably be much longer than 3 sentences, but they could never be less than 3 sentences. And usually the first sentence is known as the topic sentence. And it's a sentence that, if it's well written, will more often than not summarize the main points of that particular paragraph. So in theory, what you should be able to do is to read the topic sentences of all of your paragraphs and basically get a kind of outline of your writing. And in fact, this is a nice trick too when you are reading something, let's say a textbook, if it's well written. And not all textbooks are, I acknowledge. But if it's well written, you should be able to read the opening sentences and get a kind of outline. Now, your job is basically to support your particular position. My job is to take the opposite perspective. So if you want to say that Victor is the true monster in Frankenstein, I'm going to say no. Even though, of course, you know that I've said this in my videos, and I've also made reference to this in some of our discussion forum questions. So the idea is that you are providing evidence from the text to show Victor's monstrosity. So you don't have to prove it as an absolute. It doesn't even need to be probable. It just needs to be possible. Think of yourself almost as an attorney in a court of law arguing a case. And of course, a good attorney can argue either side of the case. The trick is, which pieces of evidence are you going to use to present to the judge and jury? And it's the same with your paper, that many of you might end up writing papers that basically are in direct contrast to your classmates, the exact opposite position. And those papers can all be equally valid if there's enough evidence in the text in order to be able to support that position. Though keep in mind that the evidence shouldn't take control of your paper. Ultimately, your paper is about your interpretations. So you're using quotation, exact language, and also paraphrase. In other words, you are putting things into your own language when it's necessary in order to be able to support a particular point. And usually it's considered bad practice to end a quotation with, or to end a paragraph with a quotation, because usually you comment on the relevance of that quote. And then you need to have a concluding paragraph. You need to have a paragraph that isn't restating the introduction, that isn't too close to the introduction. So don't just alter a few words from your intro. And try to save some impressive observation for the end, or hint at a related idea, or apply your thesis to another work. And keep in mind that conclusion as well needs to be 3 or more sentences long. Now, the second piece is the actual writing. So once you've planned things, you've brainstormed, you've pulled out some ideas, and again, hopefully you started early, and you don't need to put those ideas in any kind of grammatical form initially. Then what you're doing is you're trying to put those ideas into sentences and paragraphs. And what you're doing with your writing is addressed in the writing section of the critical paper handout. The first principle of good writing is economy, and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So this is not an easy thing to do. It's one of my greatest challenges as a writer, I must admit. The idea of being concise. So what you want to be able to do is to go through your sentences and basically see if you can rephrase them in fewer words. And generally speaking, if you can, you should. What you want to do is to try to be as concise and direct as possible. Good writing uses strong verbs and nouns. Adjectives and adverbs, be careful. They can definitely be useful in terms of making your writing more specific, but you don't want to overuse them, these descriptive words, just because you're trying to pad the paper and give a paper length. That length comes from argument, not just from unnecessary language. Better to have a shorter paper that is well written than a longer paper that is wordy or redundant. Vary your sentence patterns. So you should have a mixture of long and short sentences. Too many short sentences, the paper sounds it sounds basically kind of stilted. Too many long sentences, the paper sounds very dense. So you want to have a mixture of them, as well as vary your sentence openings. So you don't want to have multiple sentences in a row starting with the same word. Something like Victor, for instance. You want to mix things up a little bit. Some random notes. Avoid cliches. Those are overused expressions that no longer have any kind of original meaning to them. You know, it's raining cats and dogs outside, or the grass is always greener on the other side of the lawn, or dead as a doornail. The idea is that you can express this much more creatively in your own language. And there also is a greater possibility of misunderstanding. Imagine if there was a second language person who was reading a paper and was trying to understand all of these expressions. And there's a story that I tell my students that actually it's a real story, and it's a disturbing story that happened in the 1990s, and it illustrates the importance of having some sort of standardized language. And what happened was that a second language student was going to a party. He went to the wrong house, a house that had been burglarized several times previously. So let's just say the owner was anxious. And the student knocked on the door. The owner answered the door. The student asked, "Is this where the party is happening?" And the owner responded, not with a cliche, but slang. Slang is informal language that's created by one group so that other groups can't understand. So if you want to think about what adolescents do every generation, they create slang. And sometimes slang goes mainstream and everybody uses it. So this piece of slang that the owner of the house used was probably a piece of mainstream slang that just about everybody uses. And the owner of the house responded to the inquiry about the party by responding by saying freeze, which is a slang term for stop. However, for whatever reason, this student either misheard or misunderstood. He took a step forward, which is the exact opposite of freezing. Ultimately, the dictionary definition of freeze is related to temperature, not to movement necessarily. So, as the student took a step forward, the owner of the house pulled out his gun, which he always carried on him, and shot that student dead on his doorstep. So to show the importance of avoiding misunderstanding in language. And certainly the language of the streets, so to speak, the language that we use when we are talking is much different than the language we use when we are writing, especially academic writing. But this is why we've got standardization in academic writing, which is also the writing of business, which is how you can translate this writing over to employment situations, is that you want to have some sort of norm or standard so there's less likelihood that there's misunderstanding. That's why we try to avoid things like cliches or avoid slang. And one thing that I can definitely tell you that's going to seem odd is that you should be maintaining the present tense when you're talking about a piece of literature. And I'm well aware that the literature was written in the past, and I'm well aware that you read it in the past. So the temptation is that you are going to talk about it in the past. But you should talk about it in the present as if it is happening now, as if it is unfolding in the moment. That's what makes a piece of literature timeless. So it wasn't that Victor said to the creature, it's that Victor says to the creature. So you want to keep in the present tense. If you find that to be difficult, you can wait until you get to the proofreading stage, and then when you go through your proofreading, every time you've misused a past tense, you can just change it over to the present. And that's the last piece, the proofreading stage, which again, most people run out of time and they don't have time to do this. And ideally, you would set aside a few days from actually writing the paper to proofreading it so that you could read it with a fresh eye. But at the very least, you want to set aside a few hours so that you can do that. And if you have difficulty concentrating when you proofread, you might want to read backwards, which means starting with the ending of your paper and reading it towards page 1. And that means you can concentrate on the actual sentences themselves, so you can focus on things like grammar or mechanics. And read your paper out loud, because you can oftentimes hear errors, even though you may not necessarily be able to identify what the error is. But as long as you can correct it, I often liken it to listening to music. You don't necessarily need to know how to read music to hear when a wrong note has been played. The idea is that you can avoid the wrong note, or you can correct it to the right note. You don't necessarily have to articulate what musical error was made. And it's the same with grammar and mechanics with your own writing, unless you become an English teacher, and then you should have the language for it. You need to have a title for your paper, and the title should be something original. You shouldn't name the title of your paper the same as the title of the text you are discussing. So you shouldn't name your paper Frankenstein, because that title's already been taken. However, you can embed the text title into your own title. So you can say something like Monstrosity in Frankenstein. So titles are usually not underlined or put in quotation marks or bolded or italicized or put in a larger font. You don't have to do any of that. Now, when you are making reference, however, to a longer text that's already been published, something like Frankenstein, then you either underline or italicize. That lets you know that something's been published, but your paper hasn't been. If you are referencing a short story, like a post-short story that's been published, then you would put that in quotation marks. But you don't need to put your own title in quote marks or underline it, because it should not have been published. And since this is a critical paper, I'm not asking you to do outside research. That said, if you have your heart set on doing a research paper, certainly you can touch base with me, and we can talk about that. But it's actually a more difficult exercise to do a research paper, because not only do you have to gather the information of what other people have said about a text, but you still have to come up with your own interpretations. And that's really what I'm looking for in this particular class, that based on what you've learned in the course, that you can put together your own arguments. And I'm well aware that some of those arguments will be things that would have been discussed in class videos or class discussion forums. That's wonderful. That's called learning. But I'm not asking you to go out and to find scholars who have commented on a text like Frankenstein. And that hopefully will reduce some of the possibilities of plagiarism as well, which we talked about at the beginning of the semester. And to give you an idea how old this handout is, if you're reading along with me, it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. Obviously, it's got to be typed. Double spaced, 1-inch margins, pretty standard. This is the MLA, Modern Language Association, standard guidelines. These are the guidelines that we use in the humanities for writing, and this includes English classes. I know the guidelines are somewhat different in the sciences. The sciences use the APA, or the American Psychological Association. The intent is the same, though, that whatever guidelines you are using, what you are doing is providing the reader with information when you are quoting from something, so the reader can identify where that quote comes from, so that they can verify the authenticity of that particular quote. So in addition to things like formatting, such as the 1-inch margins and the double spacing just allows a place for teachers to write comments. What the MLA also talks about is using quotation marks when you are quoting exactly from a quote, word for word. And also that at the ending of that quote, in parentheses, whether you're done with the sentence or not, but in parentheses following that quote, you've got a page number. And at the very least, that should let the reader know where that quote appeared, assuming the reader knows what text that page number references. If the reader is not aware of what text that page number references, then probably in those parentheses, you would also add an author's last name as well as the page number. And if you've got multiple texts by the same author, then you probably have to give part of the title as well as the author's last name and the page number. And the way all of this works, and again, I'm hoping that this is review, is that at the very ending of your paper, you have a works cited page where you are literally citing or indicating all of the works that you have quoted from throughout the course of your paper. And they are all listed in by author's last name in alphabetical order. So basically, you just go down to the list to the author's last name of that particular quote, and then you should find all of the details of where to find that original text. So the place of publication, the publisher, the title, all of that, the date and so forth, so that if you wanted to, you could get your hands on the same edition so that you could get to the same page number so that you could verify the authenticity of that quote. Now, this is particularly important if you're writing a research paper because obviously you are using lots of sources that the reader doesn't know or is not familiar with. This is less of an issue in our class because you are writing a critical paper. In other words, you are just analyzing the original text. What that means for us is that you don't necessarily have to write a works cited page for me if you don't want to. Certainly you can, and if you do, you need to follow the guidelines. And you can find the guidelines on things like Purdue OWL, which is a great site for writing. And also you can find the guidelines on the GCC website as well, the library website. But basically, you wouldn't need to do a works cited page if you are just referencing the original text itself. Let's say something like Frankenstein. So if that were the case, then all you would need to do is use the quotation marks that you would normally use, and then the parenthetical documentation, which is using parentheses at the ending of the quote to indicate, let's say, something like a page number for where that quote came from. And you don't need to write in the parentheses the word page or PG or the letter P or anything like that. So that's the most simple way to go about documentation. And you can see that in the notes below, under writing papers, I've also got this information about the introductory paragraph listing the thesis, the author, and the text. Your body paragraphs offering evidence with quotation and paraphrase. Your conclusion giving closure. The fact that a paragraph is 3 or more sentences, with a topic sentence usually. A sentence expresses a complete idea or complete thought. Punctuation is used basically just to clarify meaning. Basically, if you want to think about the difference between ending punctuation, take 2 words like sit down. There's a difference between saying sit down, which would be with a period, or saying sit down, which would be with a question mark, or sit down, which would be with an exclamation point. So it's just a question of, ultimately, how do you want to express that? Commas are usually pauses that we take in our own language. And if you want to think about the use of the semicolon, it's used much like a period in that it divides 2 complete thoughts. But those thoughts are very closely related to one another. That's why you're using a semicolon instead of a period. And the semicolon is used very rarely, only for very special occasions to show this close connection. And I'm aware that I'm going rather fast. Again, I'm hopeful that this is something that you have some familiarity with. But certainly, if you've got questions or concerns, you can always touch base with me. Again, we're using the MLA, or Modern Language Association System of Parenthetical Documentation. And you can see that I've included links in the notes below, both to Purdue OWL, which happens to be a website from Purdue University, but it's available to the public, that goes through all of the elements of how to write a paper. And then also the GCC library website that talks about writing and citation guides as well. So that's kind of your quickie review on how to go about writing a paper. What I wanted to do next class was to talk about Poe's short stories. Again, ideally, the Poe Journal would be due at the ending of the day on the 6th, Wednesday's class, 11:59 p.m. And my hope is that by then you will have received your journal returned from me if you haven't already done so. And keep in mind that this upcoming Monday on the 11th is Indigenous Peoples Day, so there's no class. This is also one of the reasons why I was hoping to get that journal due before rather than after that Monday class on the 11th. But again, as always, if you need an extension, just ask me and I'll be happy to grant it to you. So for today's attendance question, which would be due tomorrow, October 5th at 8 a.m., and again, if you need additional time, please let me know. Which Poe story did you like the best? The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, or The Black Cat, and why? Again, there's no right or wrong answer, obviously, to this question. I'm just curious to see what your rationale is and your thinking process is. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Poe's short stories. Take care. Bye-bye.